Is government doing a good job at holding tech to account?
I'm hugely skeptical about this. I mean, being old enough to remember self regulation, yeah, that really worked with big tobacco. It's not going to work with big tech.
Welcome to Burning Platforms, our fortnightly look at the intersection between tech and politics, brought to you by Capita's Centre of the Public Square. I'm Peter Lewis. This week, we talk with author Tracey Spicer about her 7-year journey of AI discovery, which led to her book, Man-Made. But first, our rundown of the latest news from around the world with our regular panellists, Digital Rights Watch Chair Lizzie O'Shea and Health Engine CEO Dan Stinton. Well, we're back in the virtual room after our special interview with Audrey and Glenn the other week. So welcome back to Burning Platforms. Dan, welcome back to Australia. You're a little bit jet lagged, but I'm sure you're ready to match wits with us this evening.
That's my excuse this week, Peter. That's right. So we'll see how I go.
It's good to have a rolling excuse. And Lizzie, thanks for joining us. You look like you're comfy on the couch there.
Yeah, it's my favourite room in the house.
Very nice. And special guest is Tracey Spicer, who's someone that I've knocked around with for many, many years, but has just put out a terrific book, Man-Made, and we're going to be talking about that in our deep dive later in the episode. But thanks for joining us, Tracey.
Thanks for having me on. I love the show.
Great. So, look, I thought I'd kick off this week, and I was going to just sort of kick it off as a little bit of a what's going on in Canberra because it's so busy at the moment with all sorts of inquiries and pieces of legislation and regulation from all different angles. We've got the inquiry into social media and society, which has been having hearings, including a particularly spicy one, Tracey, with Meta, the Australian CEO, Mia Garlick, who copped a real tongue lashing from a number of the senators. There's been the latest of what seems like a stream of initiatives from the E-Safety Commissioner to extend her powers, this time an announcement that social media and porn sites have 18 months to come up with their own rules for managing child safety online. There's been the Senate inquiry into AI sovereignty that was handed down this week. I'm running out of breath just talking about this. Government funding age verification trials at the moment. And of course, there's the privacy laws and the misinformation laws, which are both making their way through the legislative process. So from a distance, you get the impression we're entering a period where the government is getting tough on tech. And while we might debate some of the specific approaches, at least the regulatory train has left the station. But then I checked my LinkedIn profile just before we started going to air, and it is full of tech running these big glitzy events in Canberra. Google this week totally owned federal parliament with what seemed like a very fancy event to celebrate its $1 billion investment fund in Australia. The PM and the Communications Minister were there. Came a couple of days after the Tech Policy Centre's annual shindig, where no less than Lizzie O'Shea was holding the stage while politicians ate 3D printed food. The Tech Council's put out a report on how great tech is, sponsored by Microsoft, LinkedIn and Workday. So I guess my question is, who's leading this? Who's leading the regulation of tech? Is this an episodic pursuit punctuated by a bunch of set pieces about how awesome it's all going to be? Lizzie, you were in Canberra last week for said event. What's the vibe for tech? Is this end of days or a bright new tomorrow?
Oh, I get the impression they think it's a bright new tomorrow, but, I'm not sure that I'm necessarily the best source for this kind of information, but I did attend and participate in the Tech Policy Design Centre's annual kind of event, which showcases or discusses various tech features and how we can get there. But I introduced myself by saying that my job was I sued technology companies that have done the wrong thing on behalf of people who've been harmed. And people started laughing because I think they were a bit shocked.
As if
that
no one does that in Australia.
Yeah. And so then I thought, I think I've misjudged this room. But everyone was very nice about it. Like the politicians, I think, feel there's a real urgency around taking steps in the closing part of this government's term to address some of the key harms that they thought might have progressed, or the initiatives that might have progressed at the beginning of the government's term. So I think there's a little sense of increased urgency. This is mainly, I'm talking about like TLs and independents and stuff who are talking about this. So that might be a little bit of pressure on the government. But, industry, it seems to me, is going on the front foot in terms of publishing material and reports. The Tech Council talking about the many, many, many jobs that will come about as a result of AI, and perhaps ignoring some of the other consequences of automation.
I think it's 50,000 in the next 5 years or something, is it? Or it's got lots of zeros in the
It's got a lot of zeros, yeah.
Yeah.
So I think they're on a bit of a campaign themselves, but yeah, look, I think there's been a lot of promises in this government around reforms that they're going to make, particularly privacy. So I think if they don't deliver, they're going to be in a bit of trouble there. But it's still a needle that has to be threaded, and I'm hopeful, or I'm going to do my bit to assist them with that task. But they've got some formidable opponents, I think it's fair to say.
Dan, there's a lot of focus on industry self-regulation, non-mandatory codes with the sort of Damocles if they don't get their act together. It was interesting to note that the e-safety commissioner's announcement on age verification, one of the parties doing the design is Digi, who was always in there, which is the peak body for a big tech. Is this the right way to be going about regulation?
Well, it's a trade-off, isn't it? I mean, I think we've all seen industry self-regulation and its inadequacies. Sorry to bring it up again, but probably the News Media Bargaining Code was the start of that, where the industry started with self-regulation, and as a result, the publishers got nothing really, or nothing of any substantial value, and it really took the government coming in and making that a mandatory code for there to be changed. So, the trade-off of self-regulation versus a government imposition is that you basically do slow down the progress and the development of the tech companies. That's not necessarily a bad thing, by the way, but that is usually the trade-off that comes with it. And I guess fewer jobs get developed in technology as a result of that. But I think, just speaking from experience, when you work in a tech company, you are narrowly focused on the interests of your company and how you can develop that company, and not necessarily focused on the wider implications of how the industry that you operate might be impacting on wider society. And I think we've seen this time and time again. So, I guess you have to pick your battles to a certain extent, or the government has to pick their battles. But it does feel like at the moment, Peter, to your point, the government is picking a lot of battles, and so hopefully they'll see all these through.
How are you seeing it, Tracey? Obviously, you've done a lot of work looking at the various moving parts of the tech industry. Is government doing a good job at holding tech to account?
I'm hugely skeptical about this. I mean, being old enough to remember self-regulation, yeah, that really worked with big tobacco. It's not going to work with big tech. And in Australia, we tend to follow the American example. America is beholden to the free market. It really concerns me that we're going to go down that path instead of following something sensible like the EU's AI Act, which has been spoken about and debated and then actually comes into action in November this year. So there are examples around the world that are working, and it flummoxes me that we're not further ahead in Australia. For example, the former Human Rights Commissioner, Ed Santo, did a 3-year report on AI safety, and that was 3 or 4 years ago now. There are terrific suggestions in there for a regulatory sandbox approach where we take devices and test them in a safe and smaller group before they're unleashed on an unsuspecting public. The idea about Australia having the world's first AI safety commissioner, really progressive things. And yet the government only seems to have woken up this year and thought, oh, goodness me, we better do something about it. It seems really, cobbled together.
Watch this space, although I think we're about to go into a long winter recess. So anything that's going to happen won't be happening until it's a little bit warmer in Canberra, Lizzie. And looking further afield at privacy reform, big headlines out of the US where a whole process to embed similar principles to, I think, some of those that we're talking about in Australia has fallen over. What's happened, and is this a good thing or a bad thing?
I know we may complain about our political processes or how they're influenced, but honestly, the United States is next level when you look at what's going on over there. So it's interesting that I think this didn't make more headlines, in fact, and I think that's probably because there was a reasonably significant presidential debate that took place around the same time. But what has happened?
Who won?
Well, I'm not going to answer that.
I've forgotten what happened. Yeah.
Played the fifth. So I think what has happened is there was a proposal for federal privacy laws in the United States. Many states have now implemented privacy laws with varying degrees of strength, and I'm impressed to varying degrees with each of them. But California is the high point. It's pretty widely accepted because it gives the most rights to individuals and regulators to act on privacy. But the point is that there was a proposal to introduce a federal law, which would have then taken over the field in Australian constitutional law language, but mainly meant that that would be the standard that applied across the whole country. And industry was quite interested in this, I think, for a couple of different reasons. Firstly, it would provide uniformity, so they didn't have to understand each state's laws. But secondly, I think there was a move essentially to try and neutralise some of the what they perceive to be the worst aspects of California's laws, because they would be neutralised by the federal act. So,
which we'd see would be the best aspects of California's.
That's
privacy.
right.
So
that's
what
right.
were they?
So things like, sorry, what I should say is what the bill eventually went down for was a dispute about including a prohibition on discrimination in AI decision-making systems. And there's an argument that that needs to be explicit, because even though there is protections in discrimination law, enforceability, causation, intentionality, all these things are difficult to prove if you don't have a statutory prohibition that's quite clear, which I think instinctively is understandable. The California legislation has direct rights of action as well. And if you look at the history of big tech campaigning against privacy law, what they hate the most are direct rights of action, so individuals being able to bring claims in court, and systems where you can opt out of automated decision making. And that was the other kind of key concern, or the dispute that led to the failure of this federal privacy bill. So the federal privacy bill in the US was being criticised, I think, from both sides, which is why I think it's sort of interesting politically. And, you know, I was sort of surprised it got as far as it did in that context, but now it seems almost impossible for it to be passed. But you know, criticised by industry for being too liberal in relation to protections against discrimination in automated decision making, for example, but then criticised by obviously civil society advocates for not going far enough. And then, you know, this dispute, it fell over. So, you know, Californians will remain protected. There's many millions of Americans who will not, tens of millions really, who will not have privacy protections that are baseline, in my opinion, that would have benefited from a federal act. But yeah, Californians will be able to retain their superior protections. And one of the things I'm concerned, I mean, I sort of understand the argument as well that states they say they want to be able to implement specific kinds of reforms, like New Yorkers have the benefit of certain kind of privacy reforms in relation to, for example, accessing apartment buildings, that using digital technology to do that in the form of a hob or whatever can't be used for other purposes. Seems like a very sensible law to me. But you can imagine why it might have been passed in New York, but perhaps nowhere else in the country. So to neutralise that by federal reform would seem to be a disappointment. And you can understand why states want to be able to bring their own kinds of privacy regimes. My concern remains that big tech spends, you know, $500 million a year on lobbying, and that includes, very strident efforts to kind of neutralise bills at a state level when they perceive them as being hostile. And that is a problem. You know, state legislatures are vulnerable in this sense. So is it better to have had a privacy law federally that would elevate the protections for some at the expense of others? It's hard to say, but that's not a choice we really will face anymore.
No, but I guess the relevance to Australia, Dan, is that the lobbying power of those that don't want to disrupt their business model is pretty strong. And I know you played a role both when you were working in the media and now working in industry where it's going to be disruptive. And so where is the remedy for pushing back against that sort of power?
I think this is more a reflection of the dysfunction of the US political system more than anything else. The this is disappointing, obviously, that this hasn't got enough. And we've been talking about privacy reform in the US for years now, and it's lagging the rest of the world, and especially once Australia passes its new reforms towards the end of this year. I would make the point, though, that to some extent, obviously it would be better if the US had really high privacy reform, because so many of these companies are based there, and therefore I think we'd see just a general lifting of the standards. But it is one of the few areas of law in tech where passing a local Australian or local Australian privacy laws will still have a really substantial impact, and that's different to most laws that apply to tech, because so much of the data collection can be regulated, and what you do with it and where you store it can be regulated here in this country, and that's really different to competition policy, for example, where we've complained about the fact that no one is breaking up or regulating sort of Google or Facebook or Microsoft or any of the bigger companies, because it's impossible to do that from Australia. But with privacy, at the very least, we can actually have some influence over how they operate in this country. So, I mean, look, Peter, to answer your question, what can we do to stop the lobbying power? I don't know. You're probably more experienced with that than I am. But I don't know if it matters as much as it does in other areas, and therefore that gives me a little bit of hope, actually. And I think we just have to keep pressing for the Australian government to continue with its reform of the Privacy Act. And one last point I'll make, by the way, again, I take your point, Lizzie. Some citizens, particularly those in California, have higher protections than other states that don't have any privacy regulation or any substantial privacy regulation in place. However, when the California Privacy Act, I forget the official name of it, I'm sorry, but when that came through, we did actually see almost every substantial company in America comply with that, and therefore comply with it for all of the United States and indeed for the whole world in a lot of cases. So, because America is so dysfunctional, you kind of have to approach it in this sort of state by state, piece by piece way by the looks of things in order to be able to get anything done. But there is some progress being made all the same. Again, I know I'm the tech bro here and the optimist, but there is some progress being made off the back of that, and hopefully at some stage the federal government will catch up.
Well, I would say in
Tracey, we
relation,
always sorry, go Lizzie.
I would say in relation to Australia, just quickly, the proposal is stated by the government to introduce a direct right of action. So on these two kind of key issues for tech, that one is the government is committed to, and the other one around opting out of automated decision making. The proposal from the government is currently to allow people to opt out of seeing targeted advertising, but not actually opt out of the systems itself. And that's probably been the most controversial of the government proposals. And I do wonder whether we'll see a bit of tension around that as they table this bill, if it does happen. And for what it's worth, I'm not just making that up about those two issues. Julia Angwin, from when she was at the markup, did an extensive analysis of the privacy bills as they've moved through the state legislatures, and it's worth looking up that analysis if people are interested.
Yeah, thanks for that. Tracey, we've been thinking about privacy, obviously, in the context of platform power, but also really important in terms of the feeder into the data that drives AI. I was wondering in your work how you took it, because on one level it's such a dry topic, but it's also so fundamental to thinking through the way that tech can be controlled.
Oh, absolutely. And one thing that really concerned me reading about this particular story that we're talking about is some of the provisions stripped from the latest version of the bill include, quote, a line item that would have required algorithms that are involved in consequential decisions to go through periodic impact assessments. So that's been scrapped. And these are algorithms where they use this equation to decide whether people get access to housing, whether they get a job, whether they can get increased credit, whether they can get a home loan, whether they can get healthcare. And this is what deeply concerns me. Someone I interviewed for my book, Dr. Virginia Eubanks, was writing about these algorithms that decide whether people get to keep their children or whether their children are taken away. And the algorithms, because they're based on postcodes, poorer areas versus wealthier areas, are confusing parenting while poor with poor parenting. So these are really, life and death kind of consequences. I saw some really good legislation. Well, it's kind of good. It's a bit flawed in New York with hiring algorithms, that there has to be an audit on the algorithms and the data sets every year, because bias can creep in year on year. But the problem there is the penalty is like being slapped with a wet lettuce leaf. I think it's 250 or 500 Australian dollars. And furthermore, it's only about gender and race. It's not about age. It's not about disability or any other protected categories, class, which is what we all forget about. But to your specific question, Peter, yeah, I became very concerned when I did the 7 years of research on this book, coming at it from the outside as a journalist with no experience in tech, no experience in the law, coming at it really, walking into a blind effectively, to realise how deeply the bias was embedded, because it starts, of course, with the data sets, which are inevitably historical. A lot of doctors are male, the nurses are female. It skews towards urban, white, younger, people without disability. Then the algorithms, which a couple of people I interviewed said are like an opinion expressed in code about how the world should work. And they're predominantly created by young white men in Silicon Valley with their own unconscious biases. And then all of those biases are deepened by machine learning, which is a little bit like a white supremacist going down the rabbit hole of conspiracy theory websites. And this is why I get so angry and passionate about the fact that regulation isn't keeping up with the advance in technology, because when you have these deepening biases, things can turn badly really quickly.
Indeed, and we'll go deeper into your book in just a few minutes. Beforehand, though, we need to know why you are perplexed about Perplexity, Dan.
Yeah, let me tell you a little bit more. So, Wired published this really interesting story this week under the classy headline of "Perplexity is a bullshit machine." Now, for those of you that don't know, Perplexity is I think it describes itself as an answers engine. It's effectively a new form of AI-powered search engine, if you like. And I think the founder once described it as it's as if Wikipedia and ChatGPT had a love child or something like that. It was a quote pretty close to that anyway. So look, before I get into the problem, the way it works is you can type a query into a search box, or you can simply do it audibly. And it effectively comes back with an answer to that question, with a few sources in very small print down the bottom of the page, if you're lucky. I will say from the outset, by the way, and again, I know I always say this kind of thing, but it is pretty bloody amazing. Like, for those of you that haven't used it, I would encourage you to have a go of it. It's quite remarkable, just the quality of the answers that you get on the whole. But here's the downside. The way that they have managed to get to that quality is effectively by crawling, huge swathes of the internet and websites, and crawling their content when those websites have asked not to be crawled. So the way it does this is it's a little bit technical, but stay with me. Effectively, there's a protocol called Robots Exclusion Protocol, and that was created effectively for websites to say to search engines and others that they don't want this content on a particular website to be crawled and indexed. What the Wired article found out was that Perplexity was effectively ignoring that protocol and going around and stealing all of the content on there in order to fuel its answers engine, as it calls itself. Now, this came in the wake of OpenAI coming out and saying that they did respect the Robots Exclusion Protocol. But and also, by the way, with Apple also saying the same thing. I would make 2 points, or 1 point, same point about both of those companies, though. They came out and said that they would respect that protocol after they had indexed the entire web. So they've come out and basically said, we totally respect this protocol, but and everyone else should too. By the way, we've just spent the last 10 years indexing the entire web, and we want to pull the ladder up from behind us as we go. So that's the first point. The other point then relates to...
Can I just ask you on that before you go in there? So a robot exclusion protocol, like, who can activate that? Could we? Or who's activating that, and who's the robot?
Yeah, it's a good question. I probably should explain this better. So it's effectively a piece of code, robots.txt, that you put onto pages on your website, and effectively that is then used as a prompt for web crawlers to say, do not index this content, do not copy this content. Now, I should clarify, it's just a norm. There's no law that says this is the case. And in fact, it's a little bit unclear. Lizzie can probably speak to this. It's a little bit unclear about, what laws exist, especially in different territories, around being able to scrape different websites and crawl different websites. It sort of varies by territory, as I understand it. But anyway, so this thing has existed for some years. Most responsible technology companies respect it, again, usually only after they've already got the benefit. But it's really interesting then when it comes to Google, because Google also claims that they respect the robots exclusion protocol, with the exception of search, obviously, because that's how their search engine works. Their search engine works by indexing the entire web. And as you would have probably noticed, for anyone who's played with Google Search lately, the Gemini AI component is an increasingly prominent feature on that. So effectively, Google is in the unique position because of its prominence as the number one search engine in the world, with something like a 91% share of the market. They're in the unique position of being able to say, well, we have to be able to index every website in order for our search engine to work. And every website owner has to go along with this if they want to be discovered online in any way. And so it's just interesting that while I have no sympathy for Perplexity going and effectively stealing content, where I do have sympathy for them is just from a purely competition ground, because if they don't do this, there is no way that they are ever going to beat Google or Microsoft, for that matter, in OpenAI or in AI, and be able to keep up in this race. And so I think this then just speaks to the problem that we've talked about many times, which is because of governments.
Feels like a pretty thin straw on the upside of Perplexity.
Well, sure, but
its reason for existence is otherwise the other guys are going to do it.
No, and look, I to be clear, Perplexity should not be doing this. I'm just simply making the point that we're never going to see any innovation in web, in search, or sort of the larger tech companies in general, if regulators allow these companies to exist at the scale that they operate now, without breaking them up, because there's just no way then for any smaller company such as Perplexity to be able to challenge the dominance of search in this instance, and there's many other examples. But what do others think?
I need a lawyer, Lizzie.
Yeah, I think that's fair. Yeah, I mean, as I understand it, I'm not a copyright lawyer by any stretch, but of course there's differences in the US versus Australia as to what kind of use you can make of assets, whatever copyrighted material that's available in, is it like taking a book out of the library, or is it actually just like stealing it from a bookstore? At some point, the traditional approaches in copyright kind of break down because it's a slightly novel scenario. But that doesn't mean that it should fall outside of the gaze of that field of law, or that there's not a justification for saying they're in breach. The difficulty then, I think, also becomes, I'm not sure governments have an appetite to do much about this. In fact, it seems to me governments are kind of encouraging of these, OpenAI being a proxy really for Microsoft, let's be honest, but the development of AI and embracing it as the future of society. So, I think that there's still possibilities to redress that wrong, so to speak, but it doesn't seem to me like there's an environment where the only kind of entity that's probably powerful enough to take them on, which is probably governments, aren't really coming to the table. But I agree with you, Dan. I do think they're going to have to figure out how to break this. I mean, we talked a little bit about this last week, but break up these companies. Like Meredith Whittaker, who's the president of Signal Foundation, was in Australia recently, and she was talking about these issues. But she says, we're all just, most tech companies are just tiny compared to the 5 behemoths who are dominating the entire industry. And that is unlikely to change. Even it crushes innovation. It doesn't actually create fertile terrain for innovation. It means a tiny group of companies control it, and that's an enormous problem. And so, at what point?
But surely the only way you can do it is actually to strip them of the things they've stolen. I thought it was interesting that Amazon, Apple, and Meta have created in the States the Chamber of Progress, who are dedicated to defending the long-standing legal principle of fair use under copyright, i.e., theft, and using it as and their campaign seems to be to say this is the great, amazing art. Your book's been stolen by AI, my book's been stolen by AI. I suspect Tracey's book will be stolen before it sort of got off the bestsellers list. But that's the way these guys build their knowledge of the world, just extracting it. Surely there is going to be a reckoning at some point. Otherwise, it's locked in.
Well, also look, for example, at the facial recognition app developed by, my God, someone's going to have to remind me of the Australian who owns that company.
Clearview.
Clearview, exactly. I mean, that was deemed by the regulator here in partnership with other regulators to be an illegal harvesting of data used to train the algorithm. And they just will not comply. And I mean, they're not selling their product into Australia as far as we know. We know some law enforcement agencies have experimented with it. I mean, I don't think we know whether that product's being used in Australia, but my view is you shouldn't be able to sell that product in Australia if its foundations were stolen material. And I think the same should be true for AI technology. Like, why are you allowed to sell this if if your business is built on theft?
Selling stolen goods, right?
Yeah.
Although, as Marx used to say, all intellectual property is theft, wasn't it, or something? Now, what's your take on this, Tracey? Yeah.
Well, it is absolutely theft. And I think those comments by Mira Murati, who was the interim chief executive officer for OpenAI for that period of time, were very telling, saying it's going to make human creativity expand, which is just bullshit, just a bullshit excuse to steal all our stuff, really. I thought it was interesting that she did the interview with Dartmouth Engineering because, of course, the term artificial intelligence came from the Dartmouth Conference back in 1956. And that's part of the problem here, that when the term was created, it was at a conference that was all about making money for business and helping corporations. There was no discussion about how it would affect creativity or humanity or equity. So I think these roots and this problem have been here for a long time. However, this is where I'm going to get a little bit optimistic. There are some even small tech solutions to this problem. For example, there's a fabulous innovation by the University of Chicago called Glaze, which is an app where if you're an artist, you can cover your work online with a glaze that means it can't be scraped. And I think they've just released one, I'm possibly wrong, but it's called something like Poison, which means if the companies try to scrape it, they'll get some kind of toxic virus in their system. So there are some really cool little groups and apps that are fighting back.
Feels like we've segued into your book anyway, so let's go there properly. Congratulations. Any book is a journey. I know yours has been a particularly long journey, interrupted by the pandemic and your own personal health struggles around that. But tell us why you chose to start this 7 years ago and where it's taken you along the way.
Oh, look, it's a very daggy little family story. When my son was 11, he's now 19, he turned to me one morning and said, "Mum, I want a robot slave." And in a moment of appalling parenting, we'd allowed him to watch South Park in the morning so we could get an extra half-hour sleep in. And the episode he showed me was Cartman, a very naughty boy, ordering around his Amazon Alexa like he was some kind of colonial master. I guess as a lifelong feminist.
Inspired by Cartman. Great.
Inspired by Cartman. Who would have thought 80,000 words inspired by Cartman? I had this epiphany, really, that the idea of women and girls being servile in the home historically was being built into the chatbots that were surrounding us now and in the future. And it only took a little bit of research to realise that most of the chatbots, the overwhelming majority in the business and finance sectors, are created with male voices because traditionally we've viewed them as having more authority and gravitas and testicles and all of that kind of stuff. So it started out as viewing technology through a gender lens, and then it got intersectional really quickly when I discovered automated AI-operated soap dispensers that only worked for people with white hands, not black hands. Algorithms in hospitals based on Frankenstein data sets that are not going to give a ventilator to me because I'm 57, but will give it to the 30-year-old next to me because they're viewed as more productive in a late capitalist society. So, yeah, it started a real odyssey and opened my eyes, especially coming at it as a journalist from the outside, not being a technologist or a lawyer. It was fascinating.
And where have you landed at the end of it? Like my reading of the book is that you've basically said that we've created a technology that is based on the logic that informed it. I don't know how that gets unwound now, but where did you land in terms of what you can do with what's in front of us at the moment? Is it totally changing the way that technology is adapted, or is it just changing who's driving the machines?
Oh, look, it's everything. It's multifaceted. I started the book with this idea that the bias of the past is being built into the future. And some of the leaders of the advocacy, for example, Dr. Joy Bulamwini from the Algorithmic Justice League, which sounds like a bunch of superheroes because they are really adamant that we're going to wind back the gains made by the women's movement and the civil rights movement under the false assumption of machine neutrality. And what really concerns me from a class perspective is the neo-colonialist aspect, that all the capital sits in the global north, predominantly Silicon Valley, and people are working in slave labour conditions or for $2 an hour in Kenya, for example, trying to build the machines that big tech is profiting from. So we're going to see a widening of the gap between rich and poor. We're already seeing more social dislocation because of polarisation of opinions, misinformation, disinformation, the rise of strongmen, you name it. As for solutions, well, I'm not super optimistic, but there are some that are out there. For example, if we could have some more compulsory audits of data sets and algorithms to try to change things. I mentioned before regulatory sandboxes, but we really do need almost like a modern day oversight like we had for the nuclear industry when all of that happened. I'm old enough to remember that as well. We need a global approach to change it because it's very hard to see how we can erode the power of big tech without a large-scale international movement. But having said that, you know, we forget about the power of collective action, that we have power as members of civil society and as consumers to boycott products, to contact our local members, to say to government, we want you to do something about this and we want you to do it now.
Thanks, Tracey. I thought it was really interesting that you mentioned the AI regulation earlier in this podcast, because I'm actually a fan of the regulation. When I go around and talk to people about regulating AI, lots of people are a bit down on it because they think that it's not functional. But as a quick background, it involves a risk assessment. So the way the AI is regulated is according to which risk category it falls into. And what I liked about that was it actively said some of this has to be prohibited, like not even entertained, but prohibited. And I see the utility of that kind of framing. The criticism is often that what kinds of things are risky or what are not is kind of arbitrary. And I understand that kind of criticism, but the overarching theme, I think, is a legitimate one. I wondered what you thought, given you mentioned it earlier, and in light of it coming sort of after you're coming to a conclusion, the regulation sort of after you finish writing the book, whether you think it does speak to some of the concerns that you articulated.
I think it does. I'm a big fan of regulation. I think we need carrots and we need sticks. I like the template created by the EU's AI Act, that there are things like mandatory watermarking. I know that that can be problematic because some technology can cut out that watermarking, so there needs to be a better technological solution there. But I like that they approach it from a safety perspective, that some, as you say, some innovations are just too high risk and should be banned altogether. I'm not a huge fan of prohibition overall, but some things shouldn't even make it to market. There's no doubt about that. The problem is, and we saw this with I suppose the end of the department at OpenAI that was supposed to be protecting humanity. I mean, to me, that was absolutely terrifying when that happened in May. So we do need to have more legislation and regulation, but also having, I suppose, worked a little bit in the Me Too movement and in looking at change. It starts with conversations and education and collective action. So I think it's really important for there to be some kind of movement from people to motivate governments to take that action.
Yeah, a lot of our work kind of ends up landing at the point with, if you put friction into the system by giving people a voice, you'll actually come up with better technology as well. I'm interested. I know Dan's about to come into this. Sorry, Dan, I cut you off there. But you've been going around talking at all sorts of writers' festivals and things. How do you feel the conversations go with lay audiences, not with technical audiences or bureaucrats, but do you think there is an appetite for this in the people you're speaking to?
Oh, it's so interesting looking at people's faces when you start talking about this and breaking it down and bringing it into the household and the workplace and devices that they deal with every day, first of all, you see a look of shock, and then you see a look of anger, and inevitably people will come up to me afterwards and say, what can I do? I'm going to call my local member because I'm so furious about this. I'm going to talk to my children. Why aren't they teaching this in schools? So I think we're at that. It reminds me of the classic old school 1960s consciousness raising of that second wave feminist era, where the conversations are happening, the scales are falling from the eyes, and we are about to see a lot more motivated people saying, hang on, this is not on.
Just get them to draw on digital rights watch. Dan.
I know, brilliant.
The answer for everything. The answer for everything. I'm going to bring us back to perhaps a slightly obvious topic for me to bring it back to, but AI again, Tracey, if you can indulge me. So I mean, that premise that you articulated sort of as the rationale for the book, and the fact that all of these technology is built on bias systems, it just seems to me that is, turned up to 11 when it comes to AI systems, given that all of these large language models have been trained on published, largely English, but not just English, but published content on the web, which obviously is full of all of the biases of human history, all encoded into it. And then we're using that as the basis for this machine learning. So it just seems to me, sorry, this is not a very optimistic point or question, which I'll get to in a second, but it does seem to me that we're going to be entering into a system where this problem is about to get a hell of a lot worse, not better. And then further to that, these AI systems are going to be producing content themselves, or already producing content themselves, and therefore we're going to have a huge explosion of content being produced with this bias embedded into it. So can you solve that little problem for us all here, or are we in trouble?
Oh, mate, this is the good thing about writing a book. You can just posit, all the questions and do the research and ventilate the problems, and then someone else has to fix it, right? Not me.
It's like our podcast, by the way.
That's right. Talk about the problems of the world. I am generally a glass half full kind of person, and I know from communication theory we've got to talk about this to a degree in an optimistic and hopeful way to keep people engaged. Otherwise, they'll turn off and go, it's too hard, we can't fix it. So some of the solutions, and they're not perfect, obviously, that I've been researching and reading about lately are the creation of synthetic data, of course, and some of that synthetic data, you can insert intentional bias into it. So you can put the diversity and inclusion you want into these created data sets. The idea of machine teaching, I think, is pretty cool, to get onto ChatGPT and teach it to not be so misogynistic and racist, although that does infuriate me because someone from Microsoft said that to me 2 years ago, and I said, oh, so you're trying to get us to use our unpaid labour to fix the problems that you've created, and you're making massive profits off the back of us. Isn't that modern day slavery? So I did have that fight. But there are some solutions in the creation of the data sets. One of the people I interviewed in the States, Dr. Joan Parmiter-Bajorek, who runs Women in Voice around voice technologies, said that, look, it is possible to create clean data sets. It really is, but it costs the tech companies money. And while they're more interested in sitting on their cash mountains rather than ethics, they're not going to spend that money. So there are solutions, but we need the companies to have the will to create the change. I am inspired by some leaders like Kieran Snyder. She was the founder of Textio, where you can put inclusive wording into job applications and things like that. It helps get the bias out of the hiring algorithms and that process. So I think we've really got to focus on the people doing good things. Otherwise, we just throw our hands up in the air and go, well, it's pointless.
Yeah, I read an analyst recently who talked about how it's like the reversal of that Marxist quote. The point is not to change the world with their systems, but it's to understand it, like interpret the world or whatever, that Marxist quote about philosophers interpreting the world, the point being to change it. And I do think these systems can tell us about things that are wrong as well for fixing, even if they can't fix it themselves, which I think is an interesting idea. What I was going to ask about is I'm kind of mildly obsessed with privacy reform, as I'm sure listeners of this podcast will know, but partly because I see that as the source of a lot of the problem, as in unbridled access, particularly to personal information, which of course is only one subset. Like, I appreciate large language models are a slightly different category, but in terms of algorithms that make decisions about people's lives that are pretty influential, they do rely on extracting personal information to achieve that. And I do wonder whether privacy reform is one of the key kind of weapons against both bad data sets, but then also exploitative predatory algorithms or lazy algorithms, whatever it may be. I mean, is that also your view? Like, some of these structural interventions, privacy is one. I mean, are there others? Or yeah, as opposed to, say, people in companies trying to do the right thing, I can see some utility in those overarching obligations being imposed on an industry as a whole to kind of undercut the worst excesses of the profit motive.
Yeah, it's definitely an intersection with privacy. And if you look at it under, I suppose, a larger umbrella, it's not just responsible AI or mindful AI. There's a new phrase, sober AI, which I really love. And that means sitting back and looking at where all these things intersect and what we can change to improve it for the future. Because, it's all about how ethical it needs to be. I really come at it, though, from I suppose a community perspective, to be honest, to your point about that education piece. For example, I write a little bit about the Marxist theory of interpolation in the book, which I describe in a very simple way, which is I've got a son and a daughter, right? And ever since we started getting obsessed with Netflix, the algorithms keep shoving him down a rabbit hole of shoot 'em up movies and our daughter down the rabbit hole of rom-coms, which puts them into boxes that are really easy for people to sell to, like at Target, the pink aisle and the blue aisle. So when particularly marketers can look at all of us as units to potentially buy products and breach our privacy to put us in those boxes to sell us more things, that's problematic from a bias perspective as well. I was talking to a transgender client today about this with the facial recognition technology, and she's obviously really frightened about that. Going to different countries, do they recognise her face as male or female, particularly in countries where homosexuality is outlawed, let alone being transgender? So yes, breaches of privacy put us into boxes that really work for late stage capitalism, but don't work for us, don't work for equity, and don't reduce bias.
Pretty bad for politics too. It's always like, if it was just selling you rubbish, like, yes, it's bad, but once it starts selling you ideas and views of the world, it becomes even worse. And I know that you touch on this a bit in your book, Tracey, but the way that different pathways create different versions of reality for particularly boys and girls.
Oh, yeah. I mean, look at TikTok and Snapchat. I mean, my son's studying computer science at university now, and a lot of his friends are beholden to libertarianism. They were in recent years Andrew Tate fans, they're now Joe Rogan fans, because the algorithm has forced them down that.
That's probably slightly better.
Yeah, the whole overarching theme, though, is that toxic masculinity pathway. And my daughter and all her friends are being pushed down the toxic feminine pathway with all the makeup and the hair and the Kardashians and all of that kind of stuff. So it's segmenting us in order to be able to sell us more things, as everyone here knows. But look, I'm really interested in looking at the past to change the future. And I'm really interested in Lizzie's work because of this as well, because Lizzie, you wrote that fantastic book talking about Ada Lovelace and, poetical science, the idea of STEAM, not STEM, the fact that these algorithms are not just to make money for business, they're there to create music and to make things beautiful and to make a better humanity. We forget that the very first computer code, was created by Australia's First Nations women through the medium of weaving, because it's a binary code of the warp going over and under the weft, like zeros and ones. We think about this industry as being based around the IT guy, but that's a modern construct. And we forget about Grace Hopper and the fact that in the 1950s there were more women in computing than men. So I think to create the future, we've got to look at the past.
I just want to also need to be, Sorry, Lizzie, you go.
Well, I just want to say that's nice of you to say. Thank you. And also your comment about weaving reminds me of the Ursula Le Guin article about a carrier bag theory of history that looks at how women who created carrier bags, like that's a technological innovation that has sustained life for generations, countless generations. And when we think about sci-fi, she was always criticized for not being sci-fi enough because she didn't have pointy weapons that kill people, and she talked about other things instead. And I still miss her. So anyway, I completely agree. The purpose of computer science is to bridge the divide between art and maths and science and poetry, and that's a much more expansive and better way to think about it in terms of solving some of these problems than just a bunch of people who are technically qualified and therefore somehow superior to intervene into these discussions. Anyway, sorry, Dan.
That's all right. I'll try and segue from your point to the point I was going to make, probably unsuccessfully, but you can score me later. I guess.
So start with the carrier bag, Dan. I want you to start with the carrier bag and then get to your point.
Okay, I think I'm just going to give up. The question I was going to ask you, Tracey, was in relation to the algorithms themselves, which you've talked about a lot. And it does seem to me that, to your point that you mentioned earlier, the problem with a lot of these algorithms which are driving these decisions is that they're being made typically by white blokes in Silicon Valley who have a pretty strange view of the world in a lot of cases, right? But you mentioned libertarianism, and that's sort of the home of it in the US in a lot of ways. I guess my question is perhaps slightly more hopeful, and that is that it does feel, or my statement and then question is, it does feel like there needs to almost be a collective ownership of some of these algorithms. It does feel like having an algorithm, take Google, for example, is probably the most obvious one, but one that is sort of, in a black box in another country overseas that none of us have a say over. It does feel like it's so undemocratic given how much power they have over our societies. And I just wonder that there's a role for government, I think, to play here to effectively at least and obligate these companies to be more transparent with the algorithms that they've got. And then the next step from that would be you enable local citizens to have some sort of say over these algorithms that matter and that drive our lives. It's probably a little bit highfalutin and ideological to sort of be borne out, but give me your sense. Is there any hope of this kind of thing?
I absolutely love that idea because I often, in layperson's terms, describe an algorithm as basically like a recipe. This plus this plus this ends up with this output. And I love that idea of everyone collectively owning the recipes that are creating the future. I don't know whether you've ever seen the wonderful Genevieve Bell speak, the new Chancellor of the ANU. She came up with the School of Cybernetics, just an absolute genius. And she often talks about how we owe it to ourselves to talk about a future that's fair and equitable and just. But in order to reach that, we must disrupt the present. And one way of disrupting the present is to have those big highfalutin ideas. It might seem crazy, but transparency and collective ownership are a really great way forward. I like that. Let's start this revolution now.
Well, the interesting thing, because you missed last fortnight, like talking to Audrey Tang and Glenn Weil, who have put this amazing book Plurality out, they're basically making the case for blockchain, which I've just laughed at over and over again. But it is basically a technology that the community sets the rules. And I won't claim to be an expert, but I might almost be on the cusp, Dan, of becoming a Web3 bro. I even got an idea of how a non-fungible token might work really well as a community badge for services rendered. So there is some interesting stuff there. Like,
is this when
talk
you
about a turn here. This is like, I know. I have a standing apology for most of my views. So
just give him a token. Give him a token, Peter, for your apology.
I'll give you a token in our little social network. But it does, like, the way I was going to round out this conversation, actually, Tracey, was to say, look, thank you for spending the time to think this through and to share it with such a much broader audience. But my sense at the end of it is, and a lot of these discussions is still, we are so locked in to a process now that it's going to take a lot to break out, and we could be here in another 20 years running critiques on the next terrible thing the big tech has done. So I don't know. I think getting people's consciousness raised is really, really important. But I don't think you need to leave us with another optimistic thought, because I think there is an optimism in just thinking it through and thinking how it could be better. But there is. If you don't get the literacy around what's happening to us, then we can't even start to think about some of these things, right?
Yeah, that's right. Starts with education, moves to collective action. And this is where the unions can play a really powerful role. And then it comes to conversations around inclusive design. I had a great story from one of the women I interviewed, Dr. Manisha Amin from the Centre for Inclusive Design in Sydney, who brought up the story of Braille. Prior to that, so many sighted people wasted time and money trying to create an innovation like it. And it took someone with a sight impairment to come up with one of the greatest inventions of really our lifetime. So if we think about the arc of history and how powerful inclusive design is, that can be a step forward.
On that positive note, I reckon we might pull a pin in it. Lizzie, anything Digital Rights Watch worthy to share with our listeners?
We're about to give evidence to the social media inquiry, so I'll dust off our sub for that purpose. But
we'll probably be on the same day, I reckon. Have you thrown anything up for that, Tracey, or you could just put your book in?
Not at this stage. I think they're in safe hands with the brilliant Lizzie.
Yeah. If you are listening in Melbourne, I'm doing a lunch Wednesday week, which is now going to sort of say what date it is, the 17th at Melbourne Uni, where we're talking about the public square. So if you are in Melbourne, I'll put a link to that in the show notes. And Lizzie just told me my pen's leaking. I probably do have ink on my mouth, or else I've just been having some squid ink pasta. I do chew pens often. I'll just hold it over here now. That is probably time to then cut out and go and wash my mouth and my hands. But luckily, this is a podcast, not a video. Hey, thanks for being part of it, everybody. Thanks, Tracey. Thanks, Dan.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Lizzie.
I shouldn't have messaged you.
Thanks for sending the message too. No, but anyway, such is life. That was Burning Platforms, brought to you by Capita's Centre of the Public Square. It was recorded on July 2 and produced on Naarm land by Rebecca Connell. Talk again soon.